Majestic, dramatic, awe-inspiring. These are the bridges that are worldwide icons, as well as engineering marvels.
She's beautiful.
Each of them broke new ground. The first, the biggest, the longest, and the tallest.
I'm Rob Bell, an engineer, and I'm on a global adventure to discover how and why these magnificent structures were built, and to learn about the sweat and the sacrifice that went into their construction. Well, hey!
I'm going to take you closer than ever before.
Oh, this is magnificent.
Inspect them from every conceivable angle.
Oh, yeah.
And meet the men and women who keep them working round the clock, no matter what.
Check this out.
These are the world's greatest bridges. New York. 8.5 million people work day and night to make this place richer, brasher, and according to some, greater than any city on Earth.
New York has so many world-famous landmarks, but the one I'm here to see for my money has done more than all the others to transform the fortunes of this city. And it's not the Empire State Building. It's not the Statue of Liberty. It's down there. It's the Brooklyn Bridge.
Rising 276 feet above the water, it stretches 5,989 feet from end to end. 4 massive cables hold up a suspended central span of 1,595 feet and 6 inches. When the bridge opened in 1883, it was the longest suspension bridge in the world.
In fact, there's a strong argument that it's the Brooklyn Bridge that made New York, New York.
Today, Brooklyn and Manhattan are just 2 of 5 boroughs that make up the city of New York. But in the 1860s, the city was confined to Manhattan Island. Surrounded by water, it was quickly running out of space. Whereas Brooklyn had plenty of room, but was cut off from the rest of America. So if you lived here in the 19th century, you had a problem.
If you wanted to get anywhere in that direction from Brooklyn, you had to try and cross that, the East River.
Which is easier said than done. For a start, it's not actually a river. It's a fast-flowing tidal estuary, subject to strong tides, high winds, and sea storms. Its shortest span is over 1,700 feet. Back then, if you wanted to cross it, you had no choice but to go by boat.
The Fulton Ferry Terminus, which once stood right here, was the busiest of the 5 landings over here in Brooklyn. It was served by a fleet of 13 small boats, which sailed day and night. And when the service was operating fully, they'd make around 1,000 crossings a day. But when it was too stormy, or too foggy, or too icy even to sail, the service could stop for days on end. It's no wonder the Brooklynites clamoured for a new way to cross.
In 1857, a new solution was proposed. A suspension bridge, connecting the 2 cities of Brooklyn and New York. The idea was radical, but not exactly new.
The idea of suspending a bridge using ropes or wires over some kind of chasm is an ancient one. And the first ones would have probably looked something very similar to this. A simple catwalk stretched out between the 2 sides of a big drop. It's all very simple, really. And the design principles are clear to see. Now, the part of the bridge that I'm standing on here is called the deck. And the deck hangs from these smaller ropes here called the suspenders. Now, each of these takes a small fraction of the weight of the deck and the weight of me standing on the deck up and into these larger cables here, which run the full length of the bridge. and these are called the main cables. And at each end of the bridge, the main cables are attached or anchored to solid ground, or in this case, a solid tree.
The beauty of this design is that it doesn't really matter how big the gap is from one side to the other. If you want to make the bridge longer, you just add more cable, which means it's perfect for crossing a large stretch of water. In theory, there's no limit to its length.
In practice, building a workable suspension bridge is complex. If you take this quite crude example, it doesn't take that much from me to get the whole thing wobbling and swaying around quite violently. That's all well and good up here on an adventure course, but it's not so helpful for vehicles carrying heavy cargo. And it's easy to imagine that under too much strain, the cables could eventually snap and leave me tumbling down into the undergrowth.
And the first modern suspension bridges did have a nasty habit of falling down. This one in Angers, France, collapsed in 1850, killing 200 soldiers. The cause? Vibrations as they marched across.
There were rational explanations for such disasters, and one man understood perfectly what had caused them. The same man who in 1857 proposed building a suspension bridge across the East River. His name? John Augustus Roebling.
Roebling was born in Germany in 1806 and trained as an engineer before emigrating to America in 1831. Famously difficult, arrogant and humorless, Roebling had few close friends. But what he lacked in friendship, he made up for in money.
What made Roebling rich was this: rope made from metal wire. And natural rope is pretty strong, look. This piece here can hold more than 7 tons, but it wears out quickly. Look, I can fray this up really easily and tear bits off with my fingers. In the early 1840s, Roebling read about a new wire rope from Germany and decided to start making his own.
Stronger, lighter and longer lasting than its natural equivalents, Roebling's rope was a massive hit. Pretty much any industry that needed to pull or hang things was soon doing it with wire rope.
The most innovative user of wire rope was Roebling himself. He took this rather mundane product and used it for something quite extraordinary.
This is the John A. Roebling Suspension Bridge, opened in 1866. The main span stretches 1,057 feet across the Ohio River between the cities of Cincinnati and Covington. At the time, it was hailed as a truly groundbreaking structure. But Roebling was just getting started. He was convinced that he could use his rope to build bridges at a scale the world had never seen. And he knew just the stretch of water to prove it: the East River between Brooklyn and Manhattan. But he also knew he needed political approval. And that meant dealing with this man, the boss, possibly the most corrupt politician in American history. The Brooklyn Bridge, a structure that changed engineering forever. When it opened in 1883, it wasn't just the longest suspension bridge on Earth, but the most revolutionary. It shattered accepted notions about how long bridges could stretch, what they should look like, and even how they're built.
Brooklynites supported the idea from the off. They were fed up of the old ferries and wanted the bridge as soon as possible. In 1867, leaders here at Brooklyn City Hall agreed to buy $3 million worth of stock in the newly formed New York Bridge Company.
But without the support of New York City Council on the other side of the East River, this bridge would never get off the ground. Not only did they require an additional $1.5 million of funding, they needed the city's approval to acquire the land for anchorages and approach viaducts. And there was only one place to get that approval.
Anyone who wanted anything done in 1860s New York didn't bother going to City Hall. They visited Tammany Hall, once the headquarters for the Democratic Party. The man in charge was William McGeer Tweed. He'd never been mayor or governor. He wasn't a judge. But his grip on New York was so absolute, everyone called him Boss Tweed.
He was, and still is, a candidate for most corrupt politician in American history. At his height, he had control over almost every elected politician and judge in the city. Over his 25-year reign, Tweed embezzled at least $200 million, the equivalent of about $5.5 billion today. Like it or not, if Brooklynites wanted a bridge, they needed help from Boss Tweed.
Taking bribes was such an everyday occurrence for Tweed. Nobody could later recall exactly how much he asked for, but it was somewhere between $55,000 and $65,000. Now, this was at a time when New York lawyers were making $3,500 a year, and where ordinary labourers would earn $1 a day.
Tweed not only took the cash, he also demanded a controlling stake in the bridge company. But once he got what he wanted, all opposition to the project magically evaporated. The so-called Great Bridge was at last underway. At its helm, the man who'd first proposed it a decade earlier, John A. Roebling. Roebling's Cincinnati Bridge had proved that his wire cable was the perfect material for making long suspension bridges. Prior to that, suspension bridges used chains made from metal links.
Now, a chain bridge has one potentially fatal flaw. To paraphrase a well-known term, a chain bridge is only as strong as its weakest link. Let me show you. If I take my bike chain tool here and I remove one pin, it only takes one link on a chain suspension bridge to fail, and the whole thing comes crashing down.
But that's not the case with wire rope or cable. This is made by twisting multiple steel threads together to form thin strands. These can then be twisted to form thicker ones. The whole process can be repeated until these cables reach the desired width and strength. Not only can they carry massive loads, but if one, two, or even several threads fail, there are still hundreds of other strands keeping the wire in one piece. This is what Roebling had demonstrated to such great effect with his Cincinnati Bridge. But although strong and impressive, it was nothing compared to his plans for the Brooklyn Bridge. Two gigantic towers would rise 276 feet above the water, supporting four giant 15 3/4-inch cables. Suspenders secured to the cables would support a 5,989-foot deck. Sitting on the bridge would be 5 independent carriageways, 2 for horse and carts, 2 for trains, and 1 for pedestrians. When completed, it would be the longest suspension bridge in the world.
It would incorporate all the safety features that Roebling had successfully employed here in Cincinnati. He'd have the same 4 main suspension cables, but this time making them even thicker, 16 inches in diameter. And he planned to stiffen the roadway, similarly to here, by encasing it within this steel truss, a kind of rigid box that's both light and strong. When someone asked him how long he expected his bridge to last, he simply replied, "Forever."
Roebling spent 2 years checking and double-checking every detail personally. Finally, they were ready to start constructing the record-breaking bridge. But then, in 1869, tragedy.
On the 28th of June that year, John Roebling was standing right about here on the Fulton ferry landing. He was carrying out one last check on the centerline for his new bridge when his leg got caught in a piece of rotten decking. As he tried to pull it free, a ferry crashed into the pier, crushing the chief engineer's foot.
His injuries were severe. His doctors had no choice but to amputate his toes. But much worse was to follow. The wound became infected, and within days he became gravely ill. On the 22nd of July, 1869, John Augustus Roebling died.
With Roebling gone, the whole venture was in real trouble. He was the only person in the world who'd ever built any bridge anywhere near this scale. And because he took so few people into his confidence, there was no one who fully understood his plans. Well, almost no one.
The one man he had trusted was his eldest son, Washington Roebling. He'd been his father's deputy in Cincinnati, but he'd never run a major construction job, let alone the world's biggest bridge project.
The bridge company directors had serious doubts about his ability to do it, but there was just no other candidate for the job.
So, at the age of 32, Washington became chief engineer, with the whole project resting on his shoulders.
Before Washington Roebling could start construction up there was an enormous amount of work to be done right down below.
The entire weight of the bridge, all 14,680 tons of it, are sitting on the two towers, which in turn are resting on giant subsea foundations on the riverbed.
Creating a solid base for towers this big, in waters this deep, was something not even the departed John Roebling had ever attempted.
The way to do it was with a caisson. A caisson is basically just a big upside-down box that's sunk to the bottom of the riverbed. Compressed air is pumped in, creating an air pocket. Inside the caisson, workers can dig away at the riverbed, sinking the caisson lower and lower, whilst on the surface, another group extends the top of the tower to keep it above the waterline. Eventually, the caisson will come to rest on bedrock, at which point it's filled with concrete and rubble, creating a permanent foundation.
The New York caisson was floated out to this point here in 1871, and the Brooklyn caisson over there a year earlier. Now, each was 14 feet high, and at a length of 168 feet by 102 feet wide, they were bigger than the size of 4 tennis courts combined. In fact, I'm not far off being directly above one of the corners of the New York caisson here now.
Washington Roebling personally designed the caissons, inventing a method of removing the spoils without disturbing the pressurized atmosphere. A central column would run to the bottom of the caisson, into a water sinkhole, which the men would fill with dirt and rocks. Then huge grabbers would descend from the top and remove the rubble.
Despite these advances, life in the caissons was hellish. The manual labor was backbreaking, and the pressurized atmosphere made it difficult to breathe.
The men working in the caissons became known as sandhogs. Most were Irish, Italian, or German immigrants, attracted by the generous pay of $2 per 4-hour shift. But working in the caissons could be a death sentence. Sandhogs would suddenly get gravely ill or become paralyzed. Others would climb to the surface, go home, only later to collapse and die in agonizing pain. These unpredictable bouts of illness and deaths remained a mystery until the bridge company's surgeon, Dr. Andrew Smith, put forward his own theory. Smith observed that the deeper the caisson, the more severe the symptoms, and the longer the sandhog spent inside, the more susceptible they became. He called the condition caisson disease. Sufferers characteristically bent forward at the hips, doubled over in pain. So the sandhogs started calling it the bends.
Nowadays, we call the condition decompression sickness, and we understand exactly why it happens. I've come here to the Diving Diseases Research Centre in Plymouth to experience just a bit of what those sandhogs were going through.
This hyperbaric chamber will mimic the conditions of the Manhattan caisson's final depth, 78 feet, by steadily increasing the air pressure. As I descend and the pressure increases, my bloodstream and body tissue start absorbing nitrogen in the form of microscopic bubbles. These bubbles start to compress under the pressure, just like this exercise ball.
There was so much happening as the pressure built up in here. It's effectively we were descending, getting deeper and deeper. First of all, my voice has gone this very thin, high-pitched, almost like I've been breathing in helium type voice. It's really quite hard to take myself seriously at the moment. I'm just sat here right now. I'm not really doing anything, but it is just a harder existence to be in these high-pressure conditions, these literal high-pressure conditions. Just imagine what it was like for those sandhogs, for the workers digging away at the bottom of the riverbed there in order to try and find that bedrock to build the foundations on. Absolutely horrendous, back-breaking work.
But the real problems for the sandhogs started when they returned to the surface. The chamber is now going to decrease the pressure to mimic the effect of travelling upwards.
Before we do that, though, I'm just going to blow up this ball here. That's actually quite hard doing that in this pressurised conditions. Right, I've got my beach ball fully inflated there. We're going to see what happens to that as we go back up. Keep an eye on my exercise ball down here as well. What should happen as we go back up, as the pressure in here decreases, is those bubbles that were in my bloodstream here go from small to large. But because we're going to go up nice and slowly, those bubbles will be allowed to expand slowly and be able to get back to their normal size in atmospheric conditions and leave my body without any harm. The problem with the sandhogs is that they would leave the caisson into the airlock where the pressure would be released in an instant. Then those bubbles would expand far too quickly for their bodies to cope with, bursting arteries and veins, damaging their soft tissues in their body, and could possibly lead to an excruciating death.
At least 20 men died from the bends. What we don't know is how many others suffered and survived, possibly hundreds.
But we do know the name of one victim, Washington Roebling.
He had spent months down in the caissons, supervising the building of the towers. But the prolonged effect of working at pressure had a disastrous effect on his body. He became paralyzed.
Roebling was taken to his house here on Columbia Heights in Brooklyn. He was unable to leave his bed, and many of his friends and colleagues feared the worst. For the second time in as many years, the chief engineer was at death's door, and the Brooklyn Bridge itself looked dead in the water.
We're giving you the chance to head stateside to visit not one, but two of the world's greatest bridges which feature in the series. You and a friend will head to New York for a 3-night stay at Archer Hotel in Manhattan. Whilst there, take a Circle Line cruise sailing under the incredible engineering mammoth, the Brooklyn Bridge. Then jet to San Francisco for a further 2 nights on the doorstep of the Golden Gate Bridge, staying at Cavallo Point Lodge in Sausalito. A visit is the ultimate way to appreciate these architectural New York, 1872. 3 years after work began on the hugely ambitious Brooklyn Bridge, there remained little to show for it.
John Augustus Roebling, the designer and chief engineer, died before work even started. His son, Washington, who succeeded him, was now a recluse, never leaving his house here on Columbia Heights. He'd survived an encounter with the bends, but his health was ruined.
Despite being confined to his bedroom, Roebling Jr. was determined to finish the bridge. But in order to do so, he needed help. And the person he chose to provide it took everyone by surprise. It was his wife. Emily Warren had married Roebling in 1865. When he fell ill 6 years later, he started dictating instructions for his workmen via her. Verissa Blair is the director of the Roebling Museum.
When Washington succumbed to his illness, what did Emily's role become over and above that kind of high society wife?
We often refer to her as a woman ahead of her time. It was her effort, it was her fighting, it was her ensuring that the project continued to move along, because she is who we consider to be the very first female field engineer.
Did Emily have a kind of engineering or technical background?
No, she did not. She trained herself studying engineering and math on her own and educating herself so that she would be able to properly translate the information coming from her husband. Women certainly didn't work outside the home for the most part. They took care of their children and their homes.
Not hanging out on a construction site?
No, not hanging out on a construction site, not telling people what kinds of steel and metal were needed, not changing plans, not talking to other engineers. Among the women I know who work in engineering and architecture and design, they really look at Emily as a shero.
Emily never received a single cent for her efforts. But without her, the Brooklyn Bridge might never have been finished.
In fact, she became such a talented engineer. Many people suspected she, rather than her husband, was the bridge's real driving force.
By the spring of 1872, the Brooklyn Tower foundations were complete, and the tower itself had risen about 100 feet above the waterline. To the casual observer, it looked as if the New York Tower hadn't risen at all. But in reality, it was almost as tall under the water as the Brooklyn Tower was above.
Here at the Brooklyn Tower, the caisson workers, the sandhogs, hit bedrock 44 feet down. But here on the New York side, the bedrock was 106 feet down. And as the caisson descended, the pressure inside climbed ever higher.
Washington and Emily were caught in a terrible dilemma. Keep digging and condemn yet more men to death, or stop and risk leaving the New York Tower on shaky ground. Literally. On the 18th of May, 1872, when the New York caisson was still 30 feet from the river's bedrock, the Roeblings decided it was far enough. Washington had calculated that the compacted sand the caisson was resting on would be sufficiently stable.
Roebling had no way of knowing that for sure, but his gamble clearly paid off. The foundation for this tower came to rest at 78.5 feet below high water, and it hasn't moved since.
With Roebling watching from his bedroom and Emily on the worksite, the two granite towers rose majestically from the water. To commuters struggling across the East River by boat, it seemed like the walls of an ancient Gothic cathedral had emerged from the river.
The New York Tower was completed just in time for the 4th of July, 1876, which happened to be the USA's 100th birthday. And as a battery of fireworks were set off from the two isolated towers, it looked like New York and Brooklyn would finally get their bridge.
With the towers complete, the next phase could begin. In many ways, it was the most magical part of the whole process: erecting the suspension cables.
Old John Roebling didn't invent the suspension bridge, nor did he come up with the idea of using cables in them. But what he did invent was an ingenious method for getting those cables from one side of the bridge all the way across to the other side. And he called it spinning.
The idea is brilliantly simple. A long reel of wire about the thickness of a pencil lead is attached to a massive weight or anchorage pinning the cable to the ground. A spinning wheel attached to a pulley then unspools the wire, taking it over the top of the first tower, across the main river span, over the second tower, and down the far side where it's hooked to the second anchorage. This is then looped back and repeated 278 times to form a strand. The process then starts all over again until there are 19 separate strands. Finally, all the strands are themselves bunched together and wrapped in a protective coating to make the main cable.
John Roebling had perfected the art of cable spinning here on his bridge over the Ohio River. And now I've been given special permission to see the ends of these cables where they attach to the ground. I'm heading through that little door into the anchorage. Let's have a look. Yeah. Oh, this is brilliant. This is amazing. Inside this small cabin here, this is the start of one of the anchorages, and you can see at the top here, that is where the main cable comes into the anchorage, and then it splays out into these constituent bundles of wire, and you can still see all the individual wires within the bundle. And then it connects to the anchorage down this end here. Those bundles of cable come down and they're fixed onto these steel strips with rounded ends here. They're called I-bars because they've got a hole right through the middle. And then what you can't see is that all of that is encased in this thick concrete, and it goes as far back as the anchorage. That's what connects the bridge to the ground.
The anchorages keep the cables locked in place, but the weight of the bridge is taken by the towers.
Here we go. Now, at the top of each tower here on the Roebling Bridge, the workmen had to carefully guide each strand of wire here across the top of this giant plate. Now, this is called the saddle, unsurprisingly. All the weight of the cables themselves, the bridge deck down below, the people and cars going across the bridge, any strain on the bridge caused by the wind, all of that weight, all of that force is transferred from the cables into the towers through the saddle at this point here. The saddles are what the whole bridge hangs off of. It's amazing to get up so close to it all.
And of course, it's exactly the same principle as the Brooklyn Bridge, except that was a much larger project. Its 4 main cables would contain 5,434 wires each. If you unspooled just one and stretched the whole length of the cable out, it would reach from New York to London, and you'd still have a few miles left over.
In an era when corrupt men like Boss Tweed were all too common, the Roeblings prided themselves on their honesty. Still, Emily surprised everyone when she announced to the board that Roebling & Sons would not be bidding on the contract for the cables. The rationale being that if someone else supplied the wire, the workmen would have no qualms in rejecting it if they found it to be faulty. But that's where the trouble started.
The cable contract went to a local businessman, J. Lloyd Hay. It turned out he was an average manufacturer, but an exceptional crook. His first roll of cable was perfect, meeting the Roeblings' high standards in every way. Unfortunately, that wasn't the wire he sent over to the bridge. Instead, he supplied an inferior wire, too brittle and not nearly strong enough.
It was almost a year before the fraud was detected, but by then it was too late. Miles and miles of bad wire had been spun into the cables. Weeding all of that out and removing it was just an impossible task.
In November 1877, a furious Roebling removed the contract from Hay and started supplying the cables from his own factory.
As for the bad wire, it's still in there. The Roeblings had designed their bridge to be so strong it could withstand such a weakness. And J. Lloyd Hay, he later went to prison for writing bad checks.
On the 5th of October 1878, the last of the great cables was secured in place, and they could finally start constructing the deck. This involved hanging steel suspenders from the giant cables, which in turn would hold 8,000-pound steel floor planks. As these planks started slowly creeping out across the East River, New Yorkers could finally see the bridge taking shape, and the excitement was growing.
By the time 1880 rolled around, the project was 11 years old and continuously dogged by hold-ups. The latest delay concerned the steel needed to make the giant truss around the bridge deck.
Part of the problem was the sheer amount of material that the bridge needed. Roebling used more than 6,000 tons of steel to make the trusses that gave the bridge its stiffness. But this tendency to over-engineer everything, which had kept the project going after the wire fraud, was now threatening to undo it.
The directors were growing impatient, and so was the public. Newspapers joked that one side of the bridge would crumble from old age before the other one was even finished.
And to make matters worse, Roebling's health was deteriorating. His future and that of his bridge hung in the balance. Remember, there's still the chance to win that trip to the States, giving you the opportunity to admire the Brooklyn Bridge in New York and the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco from the Grand P.O. Box 7557, Derby DE10NP. For rules, go to channel5.com/win. Good luck! The Brooklyn Bridge, the world's first truly long suspension bridge, is a wonder to behold as it soars gracefully over New York's East River. Now, close to a century and a half after it opened, it remains a vital link, carrying more than 100,000 vehicles a day between Brooklyn and Manhattan.
It's hard to conceive of this city without its many giant bridges. But in 1880, it was looking like the people of Brooklyn and New York might never get one at all.
23 years after a bridge was first proposed by John Roebling. 11 years after his son Washington begun construction. And 8 years after his wife Emily had taken over the project and become his link to the outside world. It still wasn't finished.
Washington's health had taken a turn for the worse again, so his wife, by now his chief deputy, redoubled her efforts. One by one, she patiently resolved every issue. Delays from contractors, awkward questions from politicians and directors, even potential strikes from the workmen. Her famous charm won them all over in the end.
Finally, in April 1883, the Great Bridge was at last finished. And what a sight it was. 5,985 feet long, 85 feet wide, 276 feet and 6 inches tall. The new New York and Brooklyn Bridge was not only the longest suspension bridge in the world, it was also the most expensive. It had cost over $15 million, around $347 million today. But most agreed, it was worth every cent.
Opening day was May the 24th, 1883, and the first living thing to cross the bridge that day was a chicken, carried by Emily Roebling as a symbol of victory.
The record-breaking bridge was opened with a record-breaking party. The President of the United States himself, Chester Arthur, led the procession. By one estimate, more than 100,000 people crossed the bridge that day. But there were two notable absences. One was Washington Roebling, who, fearing the crowds and excitement would overwhelm him, opted to watch from his bedroom window. The other was William Boss Tweed, the corrupt politician who demanded huge bribes in order for the bridge to be built. His dirty dealings had finally caught up with him, and in 1878, he died in jail, a broken man.
Many years later, when Neil Armstrong walked on the moon, a local newspaper interviewed an old woman about all the excitement. It's very interesting, she said, but it's nothing compared to the day they opened the Brooklyn Bridge.
When the bridge first opened, a train ran through the middle. Pedestrians could pay a cent to use the walkway, and horse and cart drivers could use the outer lanes for 10 cents. All these tolls were rescinded by 1911, when the New York mayor, William J. Gaynor, declared, "I see no more reason for toll gates on the bridges than for toll gates on Fifth Avenue or Broadway." It quickly became one of the city's main tourist attractions.
Unlike most bridges which squeeze pedestrians in alongside the roadway, this allowed people to rise above the vehicle traffic. This was the place to come and see the sights, the place to be seen. And it's every bit as popular today as it was back then.
All in all, the bridge had done what John Roebling had promised at the beginning. It forged an ever greater bond between the two distinct cities on opposite sides of the East River. In 1898, the 5 boroughs of New York had become so interdependent, they merged into one great metropolis. And the city of New York, as we know it today, was born.
Although people have been calling it the Great Bridge, newspapers on that side of the water had different ideas. As far as they were concerned, it was Brooklynites who'd been the driving force for this bridge since day one. And in 1915, the New York City Council agreed. It officially changed its name. From then on, it would forever be known as the Brooklyn Bridge.
And it's since become one of the city's greatest icons. The bridge has seen various changes over the years. The addition of a bike lane to the upper walkway. And in 1950, perhaps the most important development of all, the removal of the 2 train tracks that ran along its centre to add new lanes for cars. But one thing about the bridge has remained constant. That's the challenge it's presented to other bridge designers. How far can you go?
New York itself has responded to that challenge several times. First, with the Williamsburg Bridge, off in the distance behind me, which set a new world record for length. That was later beaten by the George Washington Bridge across New York's other great river, the Hudson. Today, this city boasts 58 major bridges, and 4 of those have been world record holders. But ask any New Yorker which is their favourite bridge, you'll probably get the same answer.
Gotta be Brooklyn Bridge.
The Brooklyn Bridge.
Who said Brooklyn?
Brooklyn. Brooklyn Bridge.
It just feels like a living part of the city.
I like the architecture and how beautiful it looks.
At night it lights up and it just makes everything look pretty about this area.
It's one of the safest bridges that we have. Roads have cops going back and forth.
It's just beautiful.
Rob Bell is back next Friday at 8 with new World's Greatest Bridges. Next tonight, new series 8 Days That Made Rome continues with the crucial moment when a young senator made his move on Mark Antony to become the first emperor. Over on 5 USA, Sheriff Walt gets ready to fight back in the season finale of Longmire. Maybe he should get some tips from Octavian.